All right, shh, quiet, speedrun time. We have got so much to get through. It is actually ridiculous. We, boom, straight through it. So, first up, you'll recall at the end of last question time, Albo got up and said something like this.
To bring in someone who has a job in our national security infrastructure and to attempt to use them in a partisan way is a very serious matter indeed. I ask you to reflect on the comments of the Member for Defence and report back to the House next week.
Old mate Speaker took that on note, did his job, comes back today and has this to say.
Just before I call the Prime Minister, I have a short statement to make. On Thursday after question time, the Leader of the Opposition asked me to reflect on comments made by the Minister for Defence in responding to a question during question time and report back to the House. When the matter was raised during question time, I made it clear that I had not heard the comments as the level of interjections was so loud as to prevent me from hearing precisely what had been said. I have, however, since carefully examined the Hansard transcripts of that period of question time and considered the relevant sections of the practice at pages 516 to 17. Even though no explicit charge was made by the Leader of the House, there was an insinuation made about the Leader of the House. I'm of the view that in context, the reference made by the Leader of the House about the Leader of the Opposition is not in order under Standing Order 90, and I would ask that such comments not be repeated. The Prime Minister.
Anyway, ScoMo just gets up and he goes through all the speakers and members who aren't going to be there today and who's going to be representing them if anyone were to ask them a question. Yeah, and then Albo gets back up and says this.
Yes, the Leader of the Opposition.
I thank you for your timely consideration of the matter I raised on Thursday afternoon. It might be just appropriate so we can just move on, given your ruling, if the Minister, if the Leader of the House can just withdraw his comments from Thursday, given that you've said
the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I have also considered this issue carefully, and at page 515 of the practice it makes it very clear that the time for a request for a withdrawal must be made at the time the remark was made. I'm not
Mr Speaker, earlier in question time, just before this debate, there was an unparliamentary remark made by the member for McMahon. I'd ask you to ask him to withdraw it.
The member for McMahon has the call.
I withdraw.
I thank the member for McMahon.
Very gracious. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker.
If, and I say if, and I certainly hope it doesn't happen again, if the matter arises, I'll deal with it then. I don't need to hear any further from the Leader of the Opposition.
So Dutton doesn't have to formally withdraw anything. It's just in future we'll be more careful. Whether or not Albo got what he wanted out of that, I guess we'll never know. We can only hope that he's happy. Anyway, question time begins, and the first question is for the member representing the Attorney General, I believe.
Questions without notice. Are there any questions? The member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Attorney-General. It's been reported by journalist Peter Van Oslen that last week the Minister strongly argued against legislating a stronger anti-corruption commission. Was the fact that the Minister paid $30 million for a piece of land worth $3 million mentioned in the discussion, or did everyone in the room just join the dots?
So, just for context, this question time comes on the 14th. So 4 days after the 10th, which is when a cabinet leak occurred, and it was basically released to the public that ScoMo had been trying to use a beefed up integrity commission. So you'll recall the questions that they asked last week about the Commonwealth Integrity Commission. Basically, ScoMo had been using that bill, that piece of legislation, or he was intending to use a beefed up version of that legislation to try and appease some of the people in this party who weren't too crash hot on his religious discrimination bill. Anyway, that all got leaked, basically, all those tactics and the fact that there was internal party discomfort or division, essentially. So this question is basically just on that. Anyway, essentially the second half of the question is ruled out of order. I'll show you that happening.
Order. Order. Leader of the House.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, the first part of that question may be in order because there was public speculation, again rumour and gossip and bits and pieces that appeared in the media, and the opposition may base some question on that. The second part was a slur and it was made to be ruled out of order. It was a political stunt, Mr Speaker, and it should be treated as such.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. It's quite specific in practice that ministers are meant to be across major issues within the media. This certainly qualifies as that. In terms of the issue of an anti-corruption commission, the minister is representing the Attorney-General in this House, and so therefore he is the appropriate person to ask. The reference to the land purchase is something that has already been dealt with as an in-order question many times in this House.
Well, not by me, it hasn't. The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The first part of the question is in order. The second part of the question, in my view, is contrary to Standing Order 90, in that it does, in my view, constitute an imputation of improper motive. I'm happy for the Minister to deal with the first part of the question. The Minister has the call.
And yeah, then the MP representing the Attorney-General just gets up and essentially does what ScoMo did last time. They made corruption allegations, which is say, oh, it's rich coming from a party like you. I'll show you bits and pieces of his answer.
There's a well-established convention that Cabinet Ministers do not comment on or disclose what occurred in Cabinet. I recognise it's been quite a long time, for very good reasons, since anybody on the other side of this House was in Cabinet, because the Australian people have not seen fit to trust you with the heavy responsibility of government. Mr Speaker, it is quite curious to be on the receiving end of lectures about probity and public policy from the member for Ballarat, of whom it was said in the ANAO report in 2014-15, number 9, the recording of funding decisions did not adequately explain.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker.
What's the point of order?
It's on direct relevance. Had the question referred to any alternative policies? As it happens, opposition questions rarely involve that. But if alternative policies is what allows these sorts of comments in, it's clearly beyond the question that was asked.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. There was no reference in the question to alternative policies. The Minister will return to the question.
You're right, Mr Speaker, but there was a clear suggestion about probity. And let's be clear, the Shadow Minister's track record when she was a minister in relation to probity was quite properly called into question by the Auditor-General.
Anyway, next question comes from Liberal, and it's just asking about ScoMo and how tough he is, and basically how he's going to stand up against Russia and against all the bullies in the world, and how Alba would never lay a hand on China and all that jazz. Anyway, ScoMo doesn't really say anything too insightful or exciting, but he does call out China at the end of his question and says China hasn't condemned Russia and they should. Thank you,
Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. From Europe to our region, the world is facing increasing uncertainty. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government is addressing these challenges and the importance of acting in our national interest with strong and consistent principles and values?
These are very uncertain times. It is a very uncertain environment, not just in Europe, Mr Speaker, but in our own region here in the Indo-Pacific. So, Mr Speaker, it is a time for resolve, time to stand up against those who would seek to bully, whether as Australia, whether as Lithuania, and indeed Ukraine, Mr Speaker. It is a time to stand up to the bullies. And indeed, as Russian troops are amassed, Mr Speaker, on Ukraine's border, we support Ukraine's sovereignty absolutely, Mr Speaker. We denounce Russia's bullying, their coercion, their intimidation and their threats of violence against Ukraine, Mr Speaker. And we will always take steps to do that. And, Mr Speaker, we have taken those steps with our like-minded partners. But I know, Mr Speaker, that the Chinese government has not stood with the rest of the world in denouncing the actions of Russia, Mr Speaker, and they should do so. they should do so. There should be no cue taken from the actions of Russia, the coercion or bullying in our
region. The Prime
region.
Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Anyway, the next question from Labor is again along this anti-corruption tangent, and it basically very explicitly outlines what I kind of briefly went over at the beginning of the video. I'll show you the question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm the only reason he planned to introduce legislation for a National Anti-Corruption Commission was to attempt to encourage one of his backbenchers, a plan which even his own ministers did not support? Instead of playing politics, why won't the Prime Minister do his job and introduce a National Anti-Corruption Commission?
Yeah, and ScoMo's going to basically dodge the question and just say, oh, we've put forward a bill which you guys haven't agreed to, and until you do, we can't really do much about it.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government developed a detailed proposal for a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. Mr. Speaker, hundreds of pages of legislation which I have tabled in this parliament. If the Labor Party wishes to support that legislation, it can become a reality. The only party standing in the way of it is the Labor Party, Mr. Speaker. Our legislation goes to hundreds of pages. Theirs goes to a two-page thought bubble.
Member for McEwen, would you like to withdraw that comment, that unparliamentary remark?
I'll withdraw.
Thank the member for McEwen.
I didn't quite catch the unparliamentary remark. I even slowed down the video and tried to, really listen in, ranked up the volume, blasted my drums. Couldn't quite catch it, but whatever. Old mate withdraws it. And we move on to the next question. This one's from Liberal, and it's for Barnaby, and basically it's just about water. I reckon they probably drew some inspiration from Bob Catter's question in the previous question time, which they didn't answer very well, at least from what I could gather. So I reckon they've tried to use this as kind of make up for that question. Barnaby doesn't say anything too exciting, basically just, outlines all the stuff they're doing fantastically with water and irrigation and infrastructure. Then there's some interjections from Labor, and he starts calling out individual members and saying, oh, we haven't heard any questions from you, haven't heard any questions from you, haven't heard any questions from you. If you don't have any questions for us, we must be doing a pretty great job.
Well, the Deputy Prime Minister outlined to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government is investing in nation's water-building infrastructure, which is securing the future of regional communities. Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
And this dam is so vitally important. And we also know the macadamia industry, for which this was so incredibly important. Now, Mr. Speaker, we want to make sure this nation becomes as strong as possible, as quickly as possible. And regional Australia is so important in that. But you ask also for alternative policies, and that's very, very hard. That's very hard because we don't even know the names of the alternate ministers most of the time. We've had the member for Ballarat, who has come to her feet today, but she didn't ask about anything about regional infrastructure. What she asked was basically a slur. That is basically all we got for her. The member for Griffith is apparently the member for water. We never hear any questions from her. The member for Blackstone is apparently regional services. Never get any questions from him. And the member for Kwinana is mining resources. The best one of law is the member for Franklin, agriculture. So important in our nation, yet we never get a question from them. We will never know about alternate policies, I say to the member for Flynn, because we never actually hear from the alternate ministers. And this just goes to show the shallowness of any alternate government that they propose.
Basically, he just points out that none of the Labor MPs have any great ideas, so I guess they lose. Anyway, don't really know what to make of the next question from Labor and the answer. I don't know where I really fall on who kind of wins out here. Basically, the question is again just about the Integrity Commission and the leak, but it's more specific.
It's been widely reported that last week a number of the Prime Minister's colleagues blocked an anti-corruption commission with retrospective powers. Why are the Prime Minister's colleagues so concerned about an anti-corruption commission with the power to investigate corrupt acts committed before it was established?
ScoMo gives Paul Fletcher the call again, and he begins his answer by just talking about the bill that they currently have pending in Parliament and not mentioning the beefed up version. And so old mate Isaacs is like, member for Isaacs, it's like he's not being relevant. Of course, the Speaker's like, oh, I couldn't quite hear. I'll pay more attention now.
And of course, we've put in place the necessary funding, Mr. Speaker. We put in place the necessary funding. In fact, in total, almost 150.
The Minister will resume his seat. Before I call the member for Isaacs on a point of order, assumedly, the level of interjections is far too high. So if the member for Isaacs is going to ask me on a point of order of relevance, it is very difficult to hear the minister. If you want me to be able to rule on points of order, you have to give me the opportunity to hear what's being said. The member for Isaacs has the call.
Thank you. I think I can assist you, Mr. Speaker, by pointing out that the minister has now spent a minute on irrelevant detail, and I do raise point of order of relevance. He should direct his answer to the question. Right. He hasn't attempted so yet.
Well, as I foreshadowed, I'm going to listen carefully to the minister. The minister has the call.
Old mate finally gets to the meat of the question, which is the retrospective powers of the potential Integrity Commission, and he claims that the Integrity Commission that is already pending in Parliament does have retrospective powers.
The simple fact is, while the Shadow Attorney-General may not like it, what I'm going to squarely is the very extensive policy efforts made by this government in developing a detailed model for a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. Now look, I know the Shadow Attorney-General is not great on detail when he doesn't have an instructing solicitor. I know that. But the facts are, Mr. Speaker, the facts are that we have a detailed model, and it's very clear that the Commonwealth Integrity Commission will be able to investigate past conduct and matters that occurred prior to its commencement.
So either the member for Isaacs hasn't done his homework, or Paul Fletcher's just kind of talking out his you-know-what. Hard to know. I don't really want to look up the bill that's pending and read through it and find out for myself. If you guys are super interested, you can go ahead and do that. He finishes off his answer by basically just talking more about the bill that they've currently tabled and saying that if you want to sign up, you're free to do so. The next question's from the member for Indi, so that's Albury-Wodonga, that's my hometown, where I'm currently chilling. And she asks about a hospital that apparently we need. I didn't know, but I guess we need a hospital. Anyway, so she asked Frydenberg, will you fund our hospital as you promised you do, or something along those lines?
The member for Indi has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Treasurer, Albury-Wodonga desperately needs a new hospital on the border. Last year, the member for Farrer said the government is 100% behind a new hospital. But Senator Hume has said the government does not have a funding role. The Deputy Prime Minister has said the same. But that's not true. The government gave Shellharbour Hospital $128 million and Geelong Hospital $50 million before the last election. So which is it, Treasurer? Does the government fund regional hospitals or not? And will you commit $300 million for a new cross-border hospital in Albury-Wodonga as soon as possible?
And Frydenberg basically just avoids blame and says that's a question for the state government. I wonder whether the fact that Albury-Wodonga straddles New South Wales and Victoria makes it very difficult for state governments to get involved in a new hospital for Albury-Wodonga. Maybe that should have been suggested in her question, and maybe she could have prevented Frydenberg from making that kind of a rebuttal. But anyway, he gets away with it. Very short answer.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question, and she has raised this issue specifically with me, and she is aware that the Commonwealth is helping to support hospitals to a record amount, Mr. Speaker. Under this government, hospital funding in Australia is at a record high, Mr. Speaker. Now, we consider a range of infrastructure projects, but as the honourable member knows, there is a real role there for state governments. State governments have a real role to play in funding those infrastructure projects. So we'll consider proposals on their merits, Mr. Speaker, but we recognise that the Commonwealth does help fund hospitals, but when it comes to infrastructure projects, state governments have a key role to play.
The next one's from Liberal, and it's again for Frydenberg, and it's just really frustrating to see Labor raise points of order that just don't have any merit, because, like, I don't think anyone is falling for the scripted, rehearsed attack that Frydenberg has been dishing out every single question time. And if they are, it's, you know, because they're low IQ or something.
Now, Mr. Speaker, at every turn we have sought to cut taxes. Every step of the way, as we've sought to cut taxes, we've been opposed by a Greens-Labor coalition, Mr. Speaker. Now, I went to the Greens website and I had a look at their tax policies, and they look like a Labor wish list. Look like a Labor wish list. A housing tax, Mr. Speaker, we've heard that before. Right? A tax on family businesses and trusts, we've heard that before. A tax on the mining sector, Mr. Speaker. A carbon tax. A carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. Higher taxes on superannuation, higher taxes on income earners. And then, of course, most damningly of all, on the Greens website, a 30-year project for the leader of the Labor Party.
Death duties, Mr. Speaker! Death duties!
An inheritance tax. Oh, no. Oh, no.
You know, Labor are too insecure, it seems, to just let him have it. They always have to jump in and make a point of order, and the fact that it never stands just makes it look even worse for them. So I don't know why they do it to themselves. But basically, Member for Opposition Business stands up, he's like, point of order, relevance. Is it an alternative policy if it's a very old policy? And the Speaker's like, yes, of course it is still a policy.
The Manager of Opposition Business, on a point of order.
Yeah, on a point of order on direct relevance, Mr. Speaker. In terms of alternative policies, exactly how far back in history is going to be considered relevant?
No,
realistically,
the Manager of Opposition
are we going
Business,
to go back to the Trojan Wars?
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Treasurer has the call.
And, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the Greens-Labor coalition...
As he's finishing, someone gets ejected. Member for McMahon gets a formal warning.
The Greens are a party who have a very clear...
The member for McMahon is warned.
And Albo approaches the desk too early, as he's done before.
I would just once again ask the Leader of the Opposition just not to approach the dispatch box until the time is up. You did. I'm not going to argue with you. The Leader of the Opposition has the call. And
he has the next question. Although it's not really a question. He asks leave or seeks leave to table his essay. I think this is the whole death duties back and forth that they've been having over the last couple of question times, and he's just kind of... I don't really understand the stunt all that much, but it's explosive. The Speaker doesn't let him finish describing his essay, and he's very offended by that. You can see him gesticulating wildly. Dutton does not give him leave to table that document. Albo leaves in a half or whatever, goes back, sits down. Check it out.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I seek leave to table The Neoclassical Theory of the Competitive Market System, an essay of mine from first year economics at Sydney University, written on the 7th of August 1981.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Order. Members on my right. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Is leave granted?
Mr. Speaker, that is a two-page document in crayon with pictures. It is not to be tabled.
Leave is not granted. The member for Gorton. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Order. Members on my right. Members on my right. The member for Groom. The member for Gorton has the call.
Then the next question is basically not a question, it's just the purpose of it, I suppose, is so that anyone listening would be like, oh, what? Something got leaked? Oh, how scandalous. Because, you know, it's basically saying, are you going to take this to the police? Which, like, yes, no, maybe, who cares? Dutton tries to rule the question out of order, so ScoMo doesn't even have to go near it. Member of Opposition Business makes a pretty reasonable defence of the question by saying that if it, goes to something too private to talk about, ScoMo can say that. He doesn't have to answer the question, but the question isn't out of order in and of itself. The Speaker agrees with him, and ScoMo doesn't answer the question.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Leaking from Cabinet is a criminal offence. Has the Prime Minister asked the Australian Federal Police to investigate the source of the major Cabinet leak designed to undermine the Prime Minister?
Leader of the House on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's impossible for the Prime Minister to answer such a question. If he's provided a reference to the Australian Federal Police, it would be in confidence to the Commissioner, and it's not in order to ask that question, Mr Speaker.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
We are allowed to ask questions about what the Prime Minister has done and what action he has taken. If he chooses to go down the path that the Leader of the House has said and decide to keep it secret as to what he's done, that's a matter for his answer. But the question is in order.
The Prime Minister has a call. The question is in order.
Mr Speaker, the member's question is mistaken.
The member for Barara has the call.
Anyway, the next question from Liberal is for Frydenberg. He's a popular guy as far as the questions go. And in the middle of it, Albo stands up for a point of order, and he does that thing where he doesn't say... Well, actually, I don't know if he's done this before. He's being a bit sneaky, but he doesn't immediately say the point of order is on relevance, because he knows that the point of order isn't on relevance. It's just, he just wants to get up and say something. But, obviously you can't do that for a point of order. So he avoids saying relevance, and he just gets up, starts shouting. The Speaker sits him down. What can you do? It's fun to watch. Check it out.
This Leader of the Opposition has never held a Treasury portfolio. This Leader of the Opposition, this Leader of the Labor Party, has never delivered a budget. Indeed, his economic policies consist of a $6 billion cash splash to pay people who've already had the jab. And he wants to remove the fuel excise, wait for it, on electric vehicles, Mr Speaker. Now that is the state of the Leader of the Opposition's economic approach. There's no excise, of course, on electric vehicles. Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition talks a big game from opposition, but in government they delivered something very, very different.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Speaker, I realise the target of this sort of lettuce attack.
What's the point of order?
The Leader of the House.
What
but
is the
still,
point of order?
well, this can't be in order for him to just go on for 3 minutes,
the leader
not in his portfolio,
the Leader of the Opposition
with a character
will state his
attack
point of order.
on myself and the Leader of the House. If you don't think of me, think of Peter.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume
there,
his seat. The Treasurer is in order, and the Treasurer has the call.
I thought he was going to table another set of finger paintings, Mr Speaker. Now, the reality is...
Anyway, the next question from Labor is on rats. Coming from Albo, check it out.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's own department has confirmed it briefed the Prime Minister throughout the course of 2020 and 2021 on rapid antigen testing. Why didn't the Prime Minister do his job and order enough rapid antigen tests when it really counted?
Anyway, ScoMo's initial answer is pretty convincing, in my view. He basically starts off by saying that rats weren't even recognised by the TGA until pretty recently, so, as if the government would be going out and buying them. Then he starts to stray a little bit, talks a little bit about vaccines and other policies. There's a point of order on direct relevance. The Speaker's like, oh, it's kind of in the scope of the pandemic, so I'll let it slide. And then ScoMo just kind of goes right off the rails, and this is good to see because it shows the Speaker of his own kind of volition getting ScoMo back on track. So that's why you should only need one point of order on relevance per question, because the Speaker himself can say, oi, get back in line. You don't need the opposition to say, oh, point of order relevance. The Speaker can determine for himself.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. At no point prior to the onset of Omicron, Mr Speaker, at no point prior to that time, Mr Speaker, had any health advisory body, not the Prime Minister's and Cabinet Department or any other department, had they recommended that the government should be engaged in purchasing rapid antigen tests. In fact, Mr Speaker, they weren't even approved by the TGA, Mr Speaker, until November of last year. The government took the action to close the borders. Right at the outset, the government did move, Mr Speaker, to put in place JobKeeper to support apprentices, Mr Speaker. And yes, Mr Speaker, we took the decision in August of 2020 to ensure that we manufactured the AstraZeneca vaccine here in Australia. So we did all of that, and we now have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. Now, Mr Speaker, if the Labor Party believes...
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, the question goes to rapid antigen testing and nothing else.
So your point of order is direct relevance?
Yes, it is.
The question does go to rapid antigen testing, but the Prime Minister is on point insofar as the COVID pandemic. The Prime Minister is relevant and the Prime Minister has the call.
If they believe that if it was the Labor Party that was sitting on these benches, Mr Speaker, that they would have achieved better results, Mr Speaker, then I don't believe the Australian people believe that for a second. Because, Mr Speaker, had the Labor Party been elected at the last election, $387 billion worth of taxes would have become a reality, and then the pandemic would have hit, Mr Speaker, and the Australian economy would have gone down the sinkhole, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will return to the question. The Prime Minister will return to the question, please.
Sorry, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will return to the question.
So, Mr Speaker, our government has kept Australians safe. We have kept our economy strong, Mr Speaker. We're one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, Mr Speaker.
Anyway, next question's for Dutton. Check it out.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I asked the Defence Minister if he would update the House on the Morrison government's commitment to a stronger defence force, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
And he just does what he's been doing last couple of times, similar to Frydenberg, just going over how good we've been at defence. Labor, they're trash, don't trust them. It's just really frustrating to see Labor, instead of just, asking better questions, or I don't know what they can do really, but it's not make points of order that just have absolutely no foundation in anything. Like the point of order. There's two of them in this question.
Defence spending under Labor fell to 1.56% of GDP. It was the lowest, Mr Speaker, since 1938. So when you hear, Mr Speaker, the men and women of the Australian Defence Force saying that they don't trust Labor, and when you hear...
Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Well, the point of order is actually irony, Mr Speaker.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. There's no valid point of order. The Minister for Defence has the call.
You don't do anger very well, Richard, you know that.
Minister for Defence.
Mr Speaker, the reality is they lost control of our borders. They lost control of our borders, Mr Speaker. That's the reality. And, it's not just this Leader of the Opposition you need to be concerned about.
The Minister for Defence will resume his seat. Just for completeness, there was no valid point of order. You can only raise relevance once. So, happy to hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and this is the occasion, the single occasion in this question where I would like to raise relevance. I fail to see how going to that is at all relevant to the question that was asked.
All right. The Minister is being relevant, and I give him the call.
It's kind of frustrating to watch. I think it's bad sportsmanship to be just wasting time like this. But anyway, next question is from Albo, and he's like, why won't the Prime Minister do his job, essentially, is the question, which is a little bit foolish. I'll let you see the question itself. Check it out.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm he failed to order enough rapid antigen tests, said it wasn't his job and blamed the states? He failed to order enough vaccines when it counted and said it wasn't a race. And during the bushfires, he went missing and said he didn't hold a hose. Why won't the Prime Minister just do his job?
Yeah, the reason why this is a bad question is because it's so vague that ScoMo can talk about whatever he wants, and he essentially does. He just mentions everything he's done as a Prime Minister, and it's pretty comprehensive, or at least he makes it sound that way. And, you know, they can't stand up for a point of order. I mean, they could, but it wouldn't get through because, you know, the question is so broad and so vague that anything is relevant to it. I'll chuck bits and pieces of the answer up.
Mr Speaker, since the pandemic hit, 1.1 million jobs have been created. 700,000 jobs have been saved through JobKeeper. 220,000 trade apprentices are now in trade training, the highest on record. Electricity bills are down 5% in the last year, 8% in the last 2 years. We are ranked second in the world for pandemic preparedness by the Johns Hopkins Index. 502,413 people are now being supported by the National Disability Insurance Scheme. That's up by 277,155, Mr Speaker, at the time of the last election. Mr Speaker, the clock will beat me, but what I can tell you is that's what doing your job looks like, Mr Speaker.
Anyway, as ScoMo finishes his answer, old mate Speaker has to formally warn people about banging on their desks.
Just before I call the member for Lindsay, I'd like to remind members that it's considered highly disorderly to be banging on their desks. The member for Lindsay has the call.
Next question's for the Minister for Home Affairs. She doesn't say anything too exciting, just about cybersecurity and stuff like that. Feels a little bit fear-mongering, in my opinion. She's like, during the pandemic, everyone's been online a lot more than usual, and that means that there's more hackers, and they're out to get you. But don't worry, we're going to protect you. We're going to look after you. Labor won't. But generally, this is where ScoMo stands up at the end and says, I ask that all further questions be put on notice, but he doesn't. I guess Labor weren't really prepared for any more questions, and so instead they do the same stunt that they did in the first question time this year, which is where they make a motion for the government to do something that they're definitely not going to do. Leave isn't granted, so they make a motion that standing orders be removed. Then you've got the bits where they finish the motion and they start yelling random stuff. Basically, I feel like they just use it to make motions, and then because they have the call, they can then yell things until Dutton stands up and says, I move that the member be no longer heard. So that happens back and forth. You've got the whole, all those in favour say aye, no, no. I think the ayes have it, noes have it. Is division required? Ring the bells for 4 minutes. So we get basically 10 minutes of voting. And I reckon that's when they come up with more questions or something. There must be some reason for it. I don't really see the point, unless they're kind of formulating more questions or coming up with team tactics or something. Who knows? Anyway.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House 1 notes, A, the Prime Minister was warned by many organisations last year of the need for rapid antigen tests, including the Australian Medical Association, the Transport Workers Union, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. B, it's reported today the Prime Minister received multiple briefings from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet on rapid antigen testing in 2020 and 2021. C, despite multiple warnings, the Prime Minister failed to order enough rapid antigen tests when it mattered and instead blamed the states. D, the Prime Minister has failed to make rapid antigen tests free and accessible for all Australians through Medicare. E, the crisis in aged care has led to the Australian Defence Force being brought in to perform basic tasks. And F, the latest failure on rapid antigen tests comes after the Prime Minister's failure to order enough vaccines. And 2, therefore condemns the Prime Minister for repeatedly failing to do his job and instead blaming others for his failures.
Is leave granted?
Leave is not granted.
Leave is not granted. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I move that so much of standing orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion immediately. That the House 1 notes and 2, therefore condemns the Prime Minister for repeatedly failing to do his job and instead blaming others for his failures. Mr Speaker, this disunited, dishonest, dysfunctional government is failing older Australians in particular.
His seat. Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I move the member be no longer heard.
The question is that the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Is a division required? ring the bells for 4 minutes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 62, noes 55. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded?
Seconded. Speaker, if there is a single failure that reflects the gross incompetence of this government, it is a failure to provide...
The Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I move the member be no longer heard.
The question is that the member for Hotham be no further heard. The result of the division is ayes 62, noes 55. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition to suspend standing orders be disagreed to. The result of the division is ayes 62, noes 55. Therefore, the question is resolved in the affirmative.
Next question is a little bit complicated and turns back the clocks a bit, back to when border closures were a novel idea. Essentially, way back when Western Australia proposed border closures, Clive Palmer wasn't having it, probably would have hurt his business or something. And so he went into a legal battle against the Western Australian government, I think, and the Commonwealth, so the actual government, ScoMo and all them guys, stepped in and covered some of his legal costs or something along those lines. Basically, taxpayer money went to Clive Palmer. Obviously, people didn't like the sound of that, and while apparently that's the conventional thing to do, ScoMo recognised that it didn't look good, spending money on the legal battles of a billionaire, and so he pulled out, essentially, which I guess is something that is unconventional. Anyway, the question is, do you regret ever stepping in and doing anything? ScoMo just kind of dodges it by saying, well, we did what we thought we had to do, and then we changed our minds. It's like, okay, cool, thanks for that.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister regret spending $1 million of taxpayers' money to support Clive Palmer's court case to force open Western Australia's borders in 2020?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is the normal course of events. It is the normal convention that when cases of that matter, of that subject matter, are heard, that it is the normal course for the Commonwealth Government to provide what we did on that occasion. Now,
Member for Isaacs will leave under 94A.
Now, Mr. Speaker, after further discussions with the Western Australian Premier and I took the decision for us to withdraw from that case.
And then we have the final question from Liberals. So this is the one they've been waiting to get out, I guess. Otherwise, they would have asked that all questions be put on notice a little sooner, probably. It's for the Minister for Immigration.
Member for Groom has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government's actions to protect women and children from foreign criminals? And is the Minister aware of any alternative policy approaches or views?
Yeah, old mate basically spends a long time talking about how this bill is going to help them deport criminals and how it's so important and it's an integral step in ensuring that all Australians are safe and women and children everywhere can live in peace and security, and how Labor they're not supporting this bill, and that's so terrible, and it's particularly Albanese who's at fault here. He should really get behind us and make this a bipartisan effort.
The Morrison government has, of course, had a bill in front of this House approaching over 1,200 days to enable the government to deport more foreign criminals from Australia who commit serious crimes against women, against children and family and domestic violence. So while the Leader of the Opposition has time to go back and look up his school homework, I'd ask him to do his homework on this bill, Mr. Speaker. And it begs the question, Speaker, why would the Labor Party oppose for 1,000 days, for 1,200 days, a bill that says the government should be allowed to deport foreign convicted criminals of serious offences? Why would the Labor Party continue to oppose this, Mr Speaker? And I say, well, it's all because of the Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition isn't taking an each-way bet on this, Mr Speaker. He's taken the multi on this. He's on every single position in the relation to the deportation of foreign criminals. We believe passionately that the law is important, the construction of the law to protect
his seat. Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker.
Anyway, Albo gets up for a point of order because he obviously doesn't like being defamed. He just skips, again, the bit where he has to say relevance, and he just... I mean, he mentions tangents, but like what tangents has Old Mate been going on? He goes on no tangents. He's very specific to the question that's asked. He doesn't deviate at all. There's no issue with relevance. But Albanese's like, oh, I want to say something, And so he gets up for a point of order and says something.
The Minister began on answering the question, and now he's going off on all sorts of tangents. He knows that he has the power now, which is why he got rid of Novak Djokovic.
Is your point of order relevance, Leader of the Opposition?
That's exactly
the Leader
how
of the
it
Opposition.
happened.
Is your point of order relevance?
Yes.
Yeah, so he raises Novak Djokovic, essentially putting into the debate the idea that, well, if it was so easy for you to get rid of Djokovic, why is it so hard for you to get rid of criminals? You know, like this bill is just a farce. You know, you're misrepresenting this whole issue. And Old Mate takes the interjection and basically says, yeah, you're right. It shouldn't be easier for us to eject Novak Djokovic. Why is it? Get behind the bill. So, I don't know. He handles it pretty well, I feel. Check it out.
I'm not going to ask the Minister to return to the question because I wasn't sure if he was straying from the question. The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Speaker. I take that interjection and I take that point of order from the Leader of the Opposition. It should not be easier to deport an international tennis star than the government finds it to deport a criminal who has raped a woman. It should not be, and that's why we seek these powers. Mr Speaker, on this question, on the question of deportation of foreign criminals, it is the Leader of the Opposition who fails the character test, Mr Speaker.
Anyway, then ScoMo says the famous line, I ask that all further questions be put on the notice paper, ending question time.
The Prime Minister has the call.
I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
And the only other thing of note that happens is Albo seeks to, set the record straight as he has frequently done over the past couple of question times. Essentially, he really doesn't like the way things ended with the Novak Djokovic debacle, and so he clarifies it, only he doesn't really clarify it. He basically just says what Old Mate said was wrong, he misrepresented me, and yeah, it's not very convincing to just say he's wrong, I'm right. But, I guess classic politics.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Perhaps the easiest way to do this is in the form of I seek leave to give a personal explanation.
Does the Leader of the Opposition claim to be misrepresented?
I do, Mr Speaker, by the Minister for Immigration during question time.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The Minister for Immigration made a number of imputations in his response. The facts are these. His imputations are wrong, as demonstrated by the fact that the courts upheld his right as a minister to cancel a visa in the globally covered case around Novak Djokovic. He knows it, the whole of the parliament knows it, and he is being deliberately misleading in his characteristic he gave in his answer.
Anyway, what a long one. Hope you guys enjoyed. Chuck a comment down in the comments if you watched the whole video, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.